Welcome to this view on Africa that focuses on Europe's policies around returning migrants to the African continent, to other regions where migrants who would have fled their countries or chosen to go to Europe are then sent back. I'm Otilia Anamalnganidze, and I'll be talking to you about the challenges that this policy that the European Union has adopted face, and presenting some recommendations on the best way forward. Since 2015, when there was a high number of migrants coming to Europe, Europe has essentially been in crisis mode, trying to find a way that they address what they termed the migration crisis. In 2015, over 1 million people made their way to Europe, a lot of them coming from the Middle East, other parts of Asia, as well as Africa. While the number of African migrants has not been nearly as high as the migrants coming from other regions, the response from Europe has been to focus a lot on African migration while also dealing with the increase of migrants from other regions. In recent years and over the past 4 years, we've seen a decline in the number of people crossing to Europe, whether from the African continent or elsewhere. By the end of 2018, there were only just over 141,000 people that migrated towards Europe. That's a great decline from the peak in 2015 of 1 million people. While Europe now sees that there isn't much of a crisis of people entering the continent, they have then changed and shifted their response towards returning people back to their home countries or to countries that are willing to receive them. This focus, or this change of focus from managing entry into Europe to putting people back, has not been without criticism. One of the main concerns, and something that comes from the recent policy brief that Emmanuel Mbiozo wrote, is that the policy on returns itself does not really respond to the reality on the ground. So in many ways, it seems a knee-jerk reaction to this need to ensure that any undocumented migrants, particularly migrants from the African continent, be sent back home, whether or not they want to be sent back home. And so one of the issues that has arisen is the need to ensure that migrants are voluntarily being sent back to their home countries and not being forced back to their home countries. It's something that has been raised as an issue of concern by the International Organization on Migration, as well as the UN Agency for Refugees and other human rights organizations that see this as a key problem. Ultimately, for us as the ISS, returns must be done in a way that is legal, informed, but also that is voluntary. This will be in line with the Global Compact on Migration that countries agreed to. At the same time, Europe needs to be having the conversation with African countries around the best way to do returns in a way that doesn't violate the migrants' rights. For Africa, they see migration as a positive thing. The African Union particularly sees migration as contributing, whether it's through remittances, to socioeconomic development on the African continent. And so they see that accepting any migrants that are not voluntarily sent back home, but rather that are forced back home, they see this as an anti-migrant stance and therefore do not necessarily support it. So much so that in December 2016, when the government of Mali was about to reach an agreement with the European Union on returns back to Mali, the community in Mali specifically, but also in other African countries, protested this move as they saw it as being a move that would actually be against the rights of people to move freely. As a result, Mali had to turn down an agreement with the European Union of close to $160 million that would have been an agreement that would see Mali cooperating with the European Union, not only in the returns process itself, but also in identifying as well as speeding up the process of getting Malians back home. Other countries have also been approached, and while some, for example Niger, have seen the need to advance their border management through these processes, they haven't agreed as such to a returns policy. Now, in terms of what Europe is actually doing at the moment, they've identified a number of countries to which they would want to send people back. The top 10 countries that Europe has sent people back to are Albania, Afghanistan, Algeria, Guinea, Iraq, Mali, Morocco, Pakistan, Syria, and Ukraine. A number of those countries are obviously on the African continent, and those are Algeria, Guinea, Mali, Morocco. But what we've seen is that there's a large number of African migrants being sent back relative to the number of people that are actually coming from other regions. So while there were only 40,000 cases focusing on West and North African migration in 2018, out of the 300,000 cases that were dealt with of migrants, the majority of people that were sent back home remained African migrants, or rather, the proportion of African migrants that were sent back home was higher. And so the concern that has been raised not only by the African Union, but by African countries, is that the European Union's returns policy has focused on trying to get the Africans back home over the other migrants from other regions. And that, in many ways, has been something that has raised great concern from African leaders. What then needs to happen is first recognizing that while returns is a key process in the migration phase, so where, for example, a migrant does not have proper documentation and or actually wishes to go back home, that European countries can and ought to be able to send these people back home, that they must do so in a way that is effective and sustainable, that they must also do so by putting more resources towards the returns process, not only in Europe, but also on the African continent, and that they must consider whether or not these migrants are going back to safe spaces. We've seen, for example, people that are being sent back to countries that are currently in conflict, while not necessarily having fled the conflict themselves, but the environment that they would be sent back to might not be the safest. At the same time, European countries, as well as African countries, in looking to good returns policies, need to ensure that the return process doesn't negatively affect circular migration, and also doesn't affect those people that are voluntarily going to Europe and have proper documentation to do so. And so one of the main issues for both Europe and Africa is that while returns are part of the migration process and may be necessary, particularly where the migrants themselves are not documented or do not have the right documentation, it has to be a process that is done safely, freely, and voluntarily on the part of the migrants themselves, because any forced returns don't necessarily result in, aren't necessarily a deterrent to migrants, nor do they necessarily result in a reduction in the number of people that want to travel to Europe.